Now, another advanced tool that we use in architectural visualization has to do with masking. And masking is another one of those universal terminologies that apply to producing digital artwork, whether it is architectural work or video work or even 3D rendering work. Masking is a concept of simply using the black and white values to determine what part of an image should be hidden and what part should be seen. Now, let's say we wanted to do a particular effect here, right? So I'm going to name this layer. Let me call this layer shaded with shadows. And this shaded with shadows layer, I am going to duplicate it. And what I'll do, I'll put this in a folder and call it backup. And this is a good practice, because if you're going to mess with the layers, it's a good idea to create a backup copy in case you did something to edit the image and you wanted to get back the original. Now let's say that we wanted to delete part of this image so that only the front part here would have the hidden line. Now we could use our eraser tool here, and we could let this tool be a little bigger, maybe adjust the hardness, and we could actually start erasing parts of this image here. And of course, if we save here, then we would get a prompt saying that, hey, some files have been updated. Do you want to update it? Yes. And then you would see that be adjusted here. Now this method of working is called linked reference working, where one file is linked to the other. Now let's try something else. Let us try and delete it. So I'm going to undo this. And instead of using the eraser tool, I could use my marquee tool here, and I could select a good portion of this, and I could also hit delete, and then I would get a straight edge. And the same thing again, once I hit save here, then once I return to that file in Illustrator, it will prompt me to update. Now, if it doesn't prompt you to update, you can always select the shadow. Okay, so let me say, do you want to update? Let's say no. Let's say that it didn't prompt you to update. You can always select the layer, and then on the control bar, you can select that link and choose update link, and it will do the very same thing. So now you can see that this area here is now updated. Now there's a couple things. I realized that if you look closely, you notice that this area here is white and this area here is gray. So that's why you're getting this weird box line here. Now to fix that, let's just repair that quickly. So we're going to go back into SketchUp, and what's happening is that we're actually seeing the section cut represented in the viewports, and we don't want to see that. So we can just actually select the section cut, and then we want to make sure that we are using our the scene. So we're going to update this scene to tell this scene that when we're saving, we don't want to see this section tool. So what we're going to do is we're going to head to the styles, and then we're going to head to edit, and we're going to say we don't want to see section planes. And once we uncheck that, the section plane goes away. However, we need to update our scene information here, because our scene information is going to need to once we click it, it is going to revert back to showing our section planes. So what we need to do is click it, and we need to update it here. And there we go. And we're going to update the selected style. Alright, great. So now we need to export this as a 2D graphic. And we're going to save this 2D graphic as shaded with shadows, PNG. Now if we come back to Photoshop, right, and we can undo this that we did here. When we come back into Photoshop, you realize that we are indeed seeing that section line here. So we need to basically delete this layer and replace it with the updated PNG that we just rendered. Now we're going to use a similar approach to what we did with Illustrator, where we use the reference linking work method. So that way, every time we save an image from SketchUp, our image in Photoshop will update, and then when we edit our image in Photoshop, our image in Illustrator will update. Now to do that in Photoshop, what we want to do is we want to right click this layer and say, hey, instead of giving me a layer, give me a smart layer, a smart object rather. Now once it is a smart object, we're going to right click it again, and we're going to say we want to link this smart object to a file, and the file we're going to link it to is called shaded with shadows, which of course is the PNG that we saved from SketchUp. Now these files are actually linked, so every time I replace that PNG file, the Photoshop will automatically be updated. Now of course I just updated Photoshop, so when I click save here and I head back over to Illustrator, it's going to prompt me to update this file again, and voila, the file is now updated. Now when I head back into Photoshop, we were just talking about erasing maybe a section of the building so that we could only have this area in view. Now if we're going to do that, we are going to be unable to use our eraser tool to erase an layer that is linked to another file. So what do I mean by that? Well, if I grab my eraser tool now and I try to erase here, it's going to give me an X, which says that, hey, you can't erase a file because it needs to be rasterized before you can erase. Now this kind of leads us to the whole approach of non-destructive editing, because if we destroy these pixels, then these pixels will be no longer linked to the PNG file that we have taken from SketchUp. So we could always rasterize this layer, and that will allow us to mess with the pixels, but then it will no longer be linked to the PNG that is coming from SketchUp. We would have to replace it each time. If we want to be able to basically have our cake and eat it, then we'll have to use a form of non-destructive editing in order to be able to edit this link file without rasterizing it, essentially breaking the link. Now the answer to achieving that is going to be done using masks. And mask is a real important part of working with different render passes. It's perhaps the most important thing. Now, understanding mask just includes understanding one simple premise. Based on values that are closer to black, those values are equal to your eraser. And values that are closer to white are basically things that will not be erased. Let's look at a quick example. If I should put a background here, and I should fill this background with white, then if I am unable to use my eraser on this linked layer, technically I could make a new layer on top and use a white brush, and if I paint, I will be appearing to erase the building. Now of course I'm not erasing the building, I'm simply putting white paint on top of the building, and that is evident because if I turn off that background layer, you can see clearly that I've put white paint here. Now if I remove the white paint, I get back the information. So what does that mean? The information was never erased. Instead, I really just did a trick of the eyes to make it look like that the building was erased. Now, ideally, we want to still be able to erase the building, but not by using these tricks of using white paint. Masking works in a similar way. Instead, masking works by telling the computer, hey, anytime I use black paint, I want you to hide, or the word is mask, this layer. Now how do we do that? We do that by adding a mask layer. So we're going to delete these layers here, and what we're going to do is we're going to add a mask to this layer. Now to add a mask, all you need to do is to click this mask here, and whichever layer you currently have highlighted, you will notice that it gets a new layer right beside it. Now think of this layer as working just like that example I showed you, but instead of painting white paint to make it look like the model is disappearing, we're going to paint with black paint, and in turn Photoshop is going to interpret that, hey, any values that are closer to black, we're going to quote unquote erase this layer. Any values that are closer to white, we are going to, let's just say, unerase this layer. Now, simply put, all we need to do is ensure that the mask layer is highlighted, and you can know that it's highlighted because you can see this square box there. Then I just need to go for my brush, and I need to ensure that I'm using black. And once I use my brush tool on this mask layer and I draw anything in black, then it would appear that I'm erasing the building. Now, this is very different than using white ink because, of course, you can see the checkered boxes behind, so you know that it's actually being erased. But the trick is that if I should flip my colors around and say, hey, let me use white, by clicking this little arrow here, let me use white ink. Now, once I draw with white ink, look what happens. It basically unerases that layer. So again, when I draw with black, it erases. When I draw with white, it brings it back. Now, every time I draw with a black, instead of the layer registering that I'm painting with black, it registers as invisible, but the mask layer, if you notice here, it is actually giving us a preview of the ink, of the black ink that we're using. Now we can actually see this in full view by holding down the Alt key and clicking on that layer. And you can see here that this is what I've been doing. This is the truth revealed behind what I've actually been painting. I've actually been painting black on white, but Photoshop just says, hey, anything on this mask layer that is represented in black, we're going to make it transparent. Okay, so let me Alt click again to turn off that layer. And this is exactly how we can work non-destructively, because notice that this layer is still linked to the PNG file. So if I change something in the PNG file, this will still update. So let's look at that example. So if I went back to SketchUp and I decided that, hey, I want to change the color of this material, well, I can go to the Materials tab here, and let's go to Edit, and we can make that material maybe a little darker. Let's make it more gray, and maybe let's make it more white. Yes, let's make it completely white. Alright, then what we're going to do is export a 2D graphic again, and we're going to overwrite the shaded with shadows PNG. Let's head back to Photoshop and look at that. Instantly you see that the changes from SketchUp are reflected in Photoshop, yet it still keeps the mask that was done using the mask layer. And of course, when I save this, I go to save, when I head over to Illustrator, Illustrator will give me a prompt rather than just automatically changing as a safety feature. And then you will see that the changes are reflected. Both that horizontal erase that I did, and also the fact that I did a color change in SketchUp. And all these files are linked together and referenced. So this is a combination of working as links and references, and also working non-destructively, because the files are all linked together. Now, there are some things that you can achieve by using a image editing or raster editing program, and you can't achieve with using a vector editing program, and the same is true for the inverse. Let's say, for example, that I wanted to well, let's add some effects to this here. So let's say that I wanted to cut a hole in this solid here. Well, I could go back to the SketchUp file. Now, let's say I wanted to cut a hole in this section here. Well, I could just draw a box. Let's draw a box like that. Then I'm going to use the push-pull tool, and well, instead of pushing upward, I'm going to push this downward, because my plan is to subtract a hole there. But before I can subtract, I need to bring up the solids tool, which I'm going to open there. And here are my solids tool. Then before I can subtract these two holes, I need to group this new solid that I just created. So I'm going to select that solid, make sure that that's the only thing I have selected, and I'm going to make it into a group. So to do the subtraction, what I'm going to do is, first I need to make sure that the box is highlighted here. Then I'm going to click the subtract tool here and select the bigger solid like that. And that should give me that tool just fine, subtracting this element here. Alright, so now I need to return back to this scene. So I'm going to just double click it, and it should carry back my view exactly as how I left it, which is good. Then I am going to export a 2D graphic again, and I'm going to export that and replace the shaded with shadows. Now once that is done, I'm going to head back over to Photoshop, and there you can see that my change has just appeared. And of course, if I save it here, then that change will carry over to Illustrator. Now before I go any further, let's say that I wanted to add some effects that you would normally only get in a vector, in a raster editing or image editing program. So let's say that I wanted to add some lighting effects to show that, hey, you know, we have some, maybe put some God rays coming down from this skylight here. Now there are a couple ways that I could do that. The first way is basically I could just draw a yellow box, which kind of represents the you know, the light kind of shining down here. So that is pretty straightforward. I could just create a new layer, and I could use my lasso tool, and maybe I would do something like that. And perhaps something like that. then I'm going to, on this layer, I would call it God rays, and maybe I would fill that using the fill bucket with that. Now this doesn't look like much now, but in Photoshop we have access to a lot of filters, and one of them would be the Gaussian blur filter. So we could apply the Gaussian blur filter to this layer here. Now if I choose to apply that filter, you can see that it kind of blurs the edges, and I should perhaps bring up this setting here, and this basically controls the amount of blur. Right, so if I did it like that and choose OK, then that would be the blur that I have there. Let me deselect this, and that blur is looking kind of good. But suppose at a later time we decided that, you know what, I should have blurred it a little more. Now back to the concept, I'm going to undo this. So we're back to the original. Now what we can do if we want to use a non-destructive editing approach is, before we apply the filters, we would convert this layer into a smart object, and then go back to filters, and we can go back to blur and apply the Gaussian blur filter. Now we can set what, let's say we wanted the filter to be about that. Maybe that's too much, maybe about that. Choose OK, and what you notice is that you get this panel below the layer, and what that does for us is that if we actually double click the settings icon here, or double click the text, we have back those settings and we can adjust it even more. So this method of non-destructive editing is really useful, so we can always go back and make changes. Now keep in mind that everything we're doing here is also carried over to Illustrator. So, you know, you would have to decide what changes what kind of effects do you want to do in Photoshop versus Illustrator. If you're doing more line related editing, then you maybe want to use Illustrator, whereas if you're doing more image editing and filter effects, then we want to be using Photoshop. Now let's combine some of the things that we learned earlier. So with the God rays, we can now use the blending modes, and we can perhaps use the overlay or the multiply blending mode. And notice what happened. This is very different than using opacity. Opacity kind of just makes everything look a bit faded, but when we use a overlay, it looks like actual light. Now the best thing to do is to combine the two, so we can also add some opacity so it's maybe not so strong. About that. And then what would be nice is if we could kind of erase this bottom section so that as the light heads down, the bottom part gets lighter. Now remember that this layer is a smart layer, so that means that we are going to be unable to use the erase tool to erase the the light, because we don't have access to destroy those pixels because it's a smart layer. But we can use the same approach that we used a while ago using the masking technique. So again, we're going to head down the bottom, make sure that we are on the God rays layer, and then we're going to choose mask. And once we do mask, notice that we have a mask layer here. So this method of non-destructive, it gives us a mask layer, but it also gives us a smart filter. So all of these things are manipulating the layer with the ability to make edits later. So we're going to use the same approach, and while we're on the mask layer, we're going to use the black brush, but instead of just erasing the light, what we're going to do is we're going to decrease the hardness, and let's maybe increase the size just a bit, maybe about that, maybe a little bigger. And then we're going to decrease the flow, which is basically the transparency or how strong the brush will work. And well, that's a little too strong, so we're going to carry it all the way down to maybe 5, and there we go. Notice that we're getting that effect where it starts off bright and then it kind of ends more dull as it goes down. Now, in addition to this, we can add some other effects using Photoshop. We could use brushes. Now, the way how brushes work is you literally can just search for brushes in Google, and you are going to get a ton of brushes, a ton of hits for places that you can download brushes. Now, a brush file is a ABR file. It usually has this icon here, and once you download this file, to activate it, all you need to do is to double click it. Now, once you do that, Photoshop will open and it will just install automatically. So what is a brush? Well, a brush, I'll just create a new layer here, and I'll go to my brush tool. We have been using brushes all along, and if I should look at the color of this brush here, which is a black brush, and if when I right click this is really just a hard brush that is 164 pixels wide and has a hardness of 0, and when I draw with that brush, this is what it looks like. And that's because we're using a flow of 5%, so we have to make a couple of strokes, and every stroke we make, it gets darker and darker because it keeps adding 5% each time. Alright, so let's get rid of that layer. Now, brushes can also have unique shapes, and this is where things get interesting. Now, these are all round brushes, but if we scroll all the way to the bottom, you can see where I installed the ray of light brushes. There's also IES brushes, there are special effect brushes. So IES brushes are pretty cool. You can get these lighting effects from IES brushes, but the ones we're going to use are going to be the rays of light. So we're going to open that up, and let's pick one of let's pick one of these that looks good. How about this one? Now, how this works is that let's put this value back up to 100, and let's pick a color that we can see. So let's use yellow. Now let's use red. Now if I click here I will get a red dot, and if I click and hold, I'll get a red line because I'm brushing using this color using a round brush. However, if I should change the shape of my brush, so I'm going to minimize that and use one of these other brushes. Let's just pick the first one here. Now when I click, I'm going to get that. And if I click and hold, I will get, well, that. The great thing about brushes is that if we choose the appropriate brush, so let's say that we choose, maybe this brush here, maybe this one. Let's adjust the size a little bit. It's a bit too small. There we go. We can also affect the rotation of the brush. And we can also change the color of the brush. So let's choose yellow. And let's call this God Ray Light. And if I click once, you can see that we get this really bright, well, in this case, maybe we should use white. So let's try using the white. It's not bad. But this is on its own layer, so we can actually use the multiply or the overlay and just kind of mix this together. Maybe turn down the opacity very low. And then I'll probably want to turn down the opacity of the God Ray layer as well. So we get this interesting mix. Like that. Now, I'm going to save this file. And of course, before I take a look on the Illustrator side, I think I want to bring back some more of the building here. So I could go for my brush, make sure that I'm using a white color now, and make sure that I'm on the mask layer for the building. Then I want to use a round brush, preferably pretty small, and of course, alright, I want to be using a white brush, and I can bring back some more. Now additionally, I could remove some, so I'm going to continue to remove some like that. Like that. There we go. And I'm just using the eraser here, but I could use my marquee tool and then fill this with black paint. That would also work, because essentially I'm just filling this area with black like that. Alright, so we're going to save this image here. Now Illustrator also has the ability to do masking as well, and the concept is the same, but the way that it achieves it is a little different. So for example, if I am in Illustrator and I'll just go to a new page, a new artboard, and if I have an object in Illustrator, let's say that I have this box, and let's say that I fill this box with a gradient, maybe a orange gradient. There we go. Now if I look in my layers tab, which we find here, you will notice that you can see that layer there. However, in Illustrator we have, think of it as like objects that are on a layer. So if I expand this down, you will see that, well, this layer only has one object, and that object is called a rectangle. Now masking in Illustrator is done by putting an object above. So for example, if I should get a, let's choose a circle, and let's say I draw a circle like that, and let's say that I make this circle, well, we can just make this circle a simple black and white image. Now in Illustrator I can use this circle as a mask to say, hey, anywhere this circle intersects this box, I want to keep those areas and throw away everything else. So what does that mean? Well, I could select my circle here, I could select the box here, and notice that the circle is on top of the box. Then I would just right click and say make clipping mask. Then what do you notice happens? This circle, wherever the circle intersects the box, is kept. Now the awesome thing about Illustrator is that this is all non-destructive. So if you look at the layer here, you will see that it has a clip group, and if I expand that group, it still has the circle and the rectangle. So that means that I can actually go back to the rectangle and I can actually move it around. So you can actually see where the circle is masking the rectangle, and I can still edit them just the same. I can edit the rectangle, and I can also tick on the circle, which is doing the masking, and I can even go in and adjust these values, and it will still mask the square, the rectangle rather. Now this is really awesome, and this provides a whole new way of masking that Photoshop doesn't possess. So if I head back to my hidden line here, right? So let me turn off the shaded with shadow. That's the layer that's coming from Photoshop. Now let's say that I wanted to let's say I wanted to like remove all of this here without actually deleting the lines at exactly this point. Instead of slicing all of these lines, what I could do is just mask this entire object, where I would say that, hey, I want to draw a box here, and everything that is inside this box I want to keep, and everything outside the box I want to throw away. So let's look at a way we can use this advanced technique to do some interesting things. So, well, first thing, which is always a good practice, I am going to group the vector paths, because this vector path is filled up of a lot of line. Like there are individual line work. I could actually move this line here that makes up the entire drawing. So what I'm going to do is select that entire layer, and I'm just going to create a group. So that makes it just easier to select, because when I select something, it will select the entire group. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate this layer, and I'm going to call this the backup copy. call this backup. Always a good idea to back up your layers in case you might need it later. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my pen tool, and I'm going to turn on the shaded with shadow layer, and I'm going to use my pen tool to kind of just follow this edge here and go all the way here. There we go. And I'm going to just fix that up with my direct selection tool. So I'm going to just adjust that line there, and that one seems fine. Now the idea, let me turn off the shaded with shadow. The idea is that I want to tell Illustrator that everything inside this shape I want to keep, and everything else I want to throw out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this object and select this layer and say make clipping mask, and then that's it. I have now masked this, but notice that these lines are still very much active. If I hover over it, you'll see that these lines are still there. So if I turn on back this layer, you see that only that is remaining. So we can do some interesting things here. So if I wanted to remove that mask, well, I can select it if I just hover over the line. There it is. Or I can use my layers tab and just say select clipping path, and then I can right click and choose, or rather I can go to object, I can go to clipping mask and say release, and now it's back. Now what I want to do here is I'm going to copy this clipping mask again, and notice that when I deselect it disappears, and that's because it has no line color. So I'm going to give it a black line color so that I can see it, and I'm going to do the same for this clipping mask as well. I'm going to give it a black line color. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to attach these two together. I'm going to use my indirect selection tool and just kind of attach that there and attach that like that. Alright, now the plan is I'm going to tell this to be clipped by this. Oh, not group, sorry. I mean make clipping mask. Then I'm going to grab my backup layer that I saved before and duplicate it. And then I'm going to say, hey, I want this to clip this area here. Now when I do that, it's going to give me an error. And the reason that it does that is the thing that you want to clip needs to be on top of the element that you're clipping. So in this case, I want this path to be on top of this group. So I'm going to move it like that. And now when I click this and that, and then I'm going to right click and say make clipping mask. So I have this back part here as one mask, and I know it is because I can turn it off. And I have this front part here, that's another mask. Now what I can do is that this front mask here, I can double click to go into that to be able to edit that group, or I can just select from the layer and select group here, and that's going to select the front mask. And now what I want to do is I want to change all of these lines. So I go to stroke and let's change them to a dash line. Now you can kind of see the dash line going on there, so I would say let's make the gaps a bit bigger. So let's try 5 maybe. Or let's try 20. And that's what we get with 20 there. That's interesting. Let's kind of zoom out, see what that looks like. Alright, now you see what we're getting here is that on one of the masks, where the front mask, it is set to a dash line. Now it's really the entire mask, but the entire group, but because we mask only the front, so only the front shows. Now additionally, we could also change the color of that stroke. So under color swatches, let us load let's load art and illustration library, and let's choose maybe a orange color. There we go. And then we can turn on that background layer. There we go. Okay, so now that we have that complete, you can see where these two layers are still fully aligned, and that's because they are coming from the same model, and that model is also fully aligned by ensuring that the SketchUp view is saved. Now, an important thing to note is that this concept can be used with any software. For example, if you use a program like Revit, because Revit can generate a particular look or technique, as long as you save the appropriate view, you can manually create your own render passes and use the different effects of each software to achieve various visual techniques. Now, just some additional little pointers. If I wanted to maybe add a kind of sky in an artistic way, so let's say for example I wanted to maybe add a partial background, maybe I add a sky to maybe just this part of the image. I wouldn't want to necessarily do that in Photoshop, or I could do it in Photoshop and import that cut image in, but it would be much easier to cut out that sky using Illustrator, right? So for example, if I grab a sky and drag that in to Illustrator, could put that on a new layer and call it sky, and I'll put that layer at the bottom. Then what I'll do is lock the other layers there so I am unable to select it. Now if I decide to use Illustrator to maybe add in an interesting sky background, the challenge will be that, well, you won't be able to modify this image. So for example, if I wanted to make the sky bluer or edit the maybe this is too dark and I want it to get brighter, Illustrator would not be the place to do that. So even though I can add the background in Illustrator and it's maybe quicker, I would probably want to add this background from Photoshop and then place it in my Illustrator scene. Now one way I could do that is I could maybe place the background like this, and then I could just mask the background. So for example, I could use a rectangle tool and just draw on top of that like that, and select the sky, right click and choose make clipping mask. So now I have masked out the image. Now if I wanted to edit this image though, and I started in Illustrator, then what I could do is, well, I could access the layer, like that, and then I could embed that image. And when I embed the image, it's no longer linked to the original source of the image. Then what I would do is unembed that image. And what that will allow me to do is Illustrator will allow me to save. So I'm going to call this sky, and it will allow me to save it as a PSD file, and then it will automatically link that PSD file. So now if I go to edit original, it's actually going to open that PSD file in Photoshop. And let's say that I wanted to maybe edit this image. Well, I could use my adjustments to change things like the brightness or the hue, but instead of using these adjustments, these are more destructive, which means that once you edit these pixels you can't change them. The better thing to do would be to use adjustment layers, and to get to your adjustment layers you need to enable it, which is here, adjustment, and there it is. So that's the adjustment layer. And what the adjustment layer does, it gives you all of these options here, and you can basically choose any one of these options and it will adjust this layer, but in a non-destructive way. So let's say I want to use brightness and contrast. Well, when I click that, notice that the layer gets this adjustment layer on top, and when I edit this layer, it will actually edit the adjustment layer, which adjusts the layer below. Now if I turn off the adjustment layer, notice that I get back my original image. So this way of editing an image is much more efficient than destructively manipulating the image, and it can't be edited again. Now, just like before, what I'll do is that when I edit that and I save it, when I return to Illustrator, that image is now updated.